And after all that, then you get an opportunity, like you mentioned earlier, to step into a leadership role for the next year and help. I'm sure that experience factored into how you wanted to help move forward into the next iteration of the line, the next year, and the overall core, and still have that high level of, Blue Devil excellence, which I will say from the outside, you guys absolutely maintained. I mean, those lines were the reason I became a Blue Devil.
Oh yeah.
You're talking about the lines that inspired you. I didn't listen to the early 80s lines as much as I wore out 86, 87, 88 Blue Devils before I actually went and saw on tour and saw lines in person. I mean, the 88 Blue Devil snare line, beginning of the show, coming off the ride cymbal on these crispy new heads, all of those little coming off the cymbal onto your head were it was iconic. It was just so like, yes. I mean, just so inspirational.
And then too, the sound quality you guys got off those flam heads, nice full sound, and it was so crisp and clean. I mean, we even joke in finals during one part of the solo, there's a roll, and the little cockroach that's crawling across the field. He stops, looks up, listens to the roll, and then stops and keeps going. You could actually see that on the video. But the 88 for me was like my first experience of seeing drum corps after being exposed to it, listening to cassettes and stuff. And I love that 88 Blue Devil show. And that's another year you guys go scorched earth all the way to the end. And then we get the magical DCI lottery draw, the one year that they do it. And man, there's so many, talk about 87 being charged with emotions. I'm sure 88 is just the same.
Yeah. It's another story about understanding the judging criteria at the end, right? Because we were better than everybody up to that point because we were out executing. But execution, by the time you get to the end, everybody can execute. So that's what caught up to us. I think the story I love about the 1988 drumline in particular is that we were very early on a disastrous course. And we only had 5 snares for much of the winter. The talent wasn't where I felt it needed to be. I was running the line, so I felt responsible. So I was on the phone calling guys that could have marched that weren't. And we found out that we had the opportunity to go to Japan that year and go perform at an amusement park on the North Island of Hokkaido. And this was going to be in April. And so we were just like trying to figure out, are we going to have enough people? And so we were getting the show and stuff like that. And the show was pretty straightforward from our perspective. And then I had to beg Sean Glide to be in the snare line because he was done. He was going to take the year off. Matt Falk was kind of part-timing it because he was studying to be a nuclear scientist. No joke.
Wow.
And we didn't have enough guys. We had rookies and stuff. So we wound up going to Japan, and we ultimately had 8 snare drummers, but we only took 7 because Matt stayed behind to study to be in college. And we came together as a drumline in Japan. And it was because it was like today's experience with the pandemic, you have the bubble, right? Japan was our bubble. We got to come together. We could practice. We could have fun. We could bond. And then when we came back from Japan, we were ready to go because we had a very intensive experience. And that set us up to actually basically perform the way we did early on. So because we were very good early on. The second thing is that we were on Mylar for much of that winter.
Oh, interesting.
On those janky Premier Mylar heads that were really thick. And then finally we just said, when we go to Japan, let's do these Kevlar things. And we got to experiment. And so I don't know if you guys saw from pictures, but we put these tone controls, muffles up near the back where your belly is.
Okay.
And it actually eliminates the overtone. And then we changed drumsticks. We actually went with a Silver Fox stick that had a beefier bead and shoulder so that we could drum through the Kevlar.
Yeah.
Instead of the sticks bouncing off, we were, very much drumming through those. And that paid off because the sound quality was very good because we were very in tune, no pun intended, of just trying to figure out the quality of sound on those new heads. And we figured out all of that from April to June of that year, which was very late.
Before going to Silver Fox, what kind of sticks did you guys used to play on before that?
We were using a combination of, they were Silver Fox, but they had a different weight. They had a smaller shoulder, and so they didn't necessarily get through the Kevlar. They were very good for the Striders, for the Silver Dots, but it was just a different model of Silver Fox. And then guys idolized the years of the past, so we used these Slingerland 3S sticks with the teardrop bead, and so we would toy around with those. But the Silver Fox we used were, I think, in fact, the other group using them, I think the Cavaliers were using those well, and they had a similar kind of, I think, sentiment about trying to get through that Kevlar.
Yeah, when I was a young man, I used to love those Silver Fox sticks.
I mean, Kevin, it's funny that you described those Premier heads and those Silver Fox sticks because literally that's exactly what we used in high school. I love that.
I went on a road trip just to find some Silver Fox sticks, and but you guys didn't use the ones with the black tip, did you?
No, we didn't use the nylon tips. They were wood.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want, the tips flying off in the middle of the drum solo.
Yeah.
So,
Kevin, so when we were getting ready for this interview, I actually took it upon myself to reach out to a couple of people that you know. And so I reached out to Macintosh and I said, what do I need to ask Kevin about 88? And he said, ask him about the time Float stole his drum. What's that story?
This is a great story. It's a lesson in responsibility. As you know, when you're an instructor, you have to make sure the line can kind of, wipe their own noses and they're going to do the right thing. And I can't remember the exact circumstances, but it was one of those things where Float had told us to make sure our drums were lined up somewhere or they were put away somewhere and stuff like that. And we were pretty good about being uniform. Like we would line our stuff up, and then we'd like go to dinner or something and the stuff would still be sitting there. And I think Float was trying to make the point that I told you guys to put your stuff away. And so we all come back from dinner and my drum is gone. And I'm like, what is going on here? So I was, I thought someone was playing a joke on me. Turns out it was Float, but he was just trying to prove a point.
Yeah.
But it was definitely about being responsible for your equipment. And I'm going to make an example out of the section leader. So it's fun.
Yeah, I've seen some behind the scenes videos of you guys from 88. You guys seem like you were quite the cast of characters in that drum line.
Yeah, our snare line was 8 guys, and there were characters like Morgan Case in the quad line, who was super funny and just a great guy. Josh Beals, so we had a great fun drum line. But the snare line in particular was separated by 4 and 4, and unfortunately, we called it the fat side and the skinny side. So
I actually have heard that. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So I was fortunate to be on the skinny side. Dave Krepp, who was thin as a rail, was on the skinny side. Sean Glide was as well. And one of the guys on the other side who was super funny was Dave Walters. He was a comedian. And then Larry Cohen was also very, very funny.
Yep.
And these guys were just always clowning around. And, I'm trying to get us all serious, and those guys are monkeying around and telling jokes. And so we had a lot of fun, but when it came down to it, when it was time to drum, you'll probably find videos where we're super loose, and then when we're drumming, it's like we turn it on, and that's a Blue Devil thing. Like you should be able to relax, but you should know when to turn it on. And that was one of those years that there was a lot of that. Can
we get any stories from back then with you cast of characters that you guys had? Any stories you could tell?
What was funny is that since we were all living out there, you had a ton of time on your hands, and everybody crammed into apartments. They lived 4 or 5, 6 to an apartment. They'd drum all day, and they'd get into trouble, right? So there was always the odd story about they had gone out or they'd gone to Mexico or whatever, and it just seemed like, look, as long as you show up and are ready to drum, you guys you're adults, make it happen. Some of us had to work. I had to work a full-time job. I was delivering blueprints, for God's sake. Then I was a busboy, so it wasn't glamorous. But then, I'd show up and, it's time to drum. Get it on. Sticks up and shut up.
What was your guys' staff size back then, like when you marched from 86 through 88? Yeah, it's not like what it is now, right? It was just a couple people and that was it?
I'm astonished. Today they do a press release and there's like 20 people on staff just for the drum line.
Yeah.
And they work in shifts.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's and believe me, that's great because it's just a different world now, right? I mean, you've got to manage labor differently.
Yes.
People are coming in at different times. Back then, you had the head instructor, in this case, Tom Float. Then you had a strong number 2 in Scott Johnson, and he ran the quads. That's how they did it. Is Tom was the snare tech and their head rider, and then you had Scott, and then we had a bass drum instructor, and it could have been like Keith Higgins was the bass drum instructor one year. He was a brilliant quad player, but he was teaching the bass drum, so an experienced drum corps guy. Then you had Catherine, who ran the pit, and then the cymbals taught themselves. They didn't even have a separate instructor. So you're talking about a drum staff of 4 people, and they ran the world's best drum line for years. And even when I started teaching, it was about the same size, usually 4 or 5 guys running the entire drum line for years. And that was it. You had one person dedicated to the section. That was their job, their full-time job, and they had to make their section great.
Yeah. Was 88 the last year for the cymbal line at Blue Devils, or was it 89? I want to say it was 88.
No, they played in, I want to say they were around in 89.
I thought also. Maybe the Contras or the Pit came out and brought cymbals.
Oh, maybe.
Out. Yeah,
maybe.
I'm not too sure, but whatever. I know that like the cymbal lines from 88 or 86 through 88, that was their own show. They did like some crazy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
those were great guys. They understood that they were a part of the entertainment, and they did some really, really cool stuff. And they were there, whether it was, providing accessories as cymbals for us to play on, or they were, really doing intense parts of the show, or they were, part of the drill. I mean, they got it. So they were an important part of it.
So we talked a little bit about 87 finals. How was that 88 finals retreat? Was it still like, was it as equal to or greater than 87? Or, I mean...
Well, that was a surprise because they didn't disclose the placements for quarterfinals and semifinals. So you really had no idea going into finals. And it was a shock because of what our run was like up to that point.
Yeah.
And then you started to dive into the scores, and the drumline didn't score very well. And we were like, what happened? So we were confused. A lot of us were just simply done. Like that was my age out year. I was ready to move on. And so it was a bit of a relief. And then at the same time, you're like, what could we have done differently? We're not really sure. But it was a big surprise because they just didn't tell us going in. Like, I think going into finals, had we known that we were in third, or I think we were in second, maybe the intensity would have been dialed up a little bit more, right? But I don't know. And then the other one was because of the draw, we were on very early finals night. I think we were on 6th or something like that out of 12, and we were literally performing in the daytime. So it's like, wait, the Blue Devils performing in the daytime
on finals night.
That was a little unusual.
And that's got to be like, you go all these shows undefeated, and then you get to finals week and you go on first in your block, because I guess they had it split in a couple blocks where and it's like, I know VK had been finishing high up, and then by the luck of the draw they ended up going on very first. And I joke with guys that march that I said breakfast with the VK, could you hear the roosters crowing? And it's kind of sad that you work so hard and then for that to happen, the luck of the draw.
Yeah, and I don't know if I buy into the whole conspiracy theory thing about the draw. I think that if you're, Drum Corps International, you're trying to change it up. You're trying to do things differently to create some mystique, and I totally get it, right? Because you do the same thing every year, people are going to get tired of it. I'm a big fan of like Drum Corps progress, just in general, changing it up and doing something different. So the conspiracy thing to me is just an excuse I think we got beat that night. And I think that anyone else, even, if you were on the field, even right next to me, right, we played great. But everybody plays great on finals night. Yeah. So you're splitting hairs at that point.
So you talked about being done, but clearly after you aged out, you still had a little itch left in you as a performer, right? Because you went and went to UNT for a little while.
That's right. Yeah.
How did that come about? How did you decide to make that kind of? And was there, like, you aged out in '88? When did you actually? Did you do nothing for a little while and then decide to go to UNT, or what was that time like for you?
I think the way to sum it up is I was glad that I was done with drum corps so that I could pursue playing drum set more. Mm-hmm. And so I played in Hollywood. I did the Sunset Strip thing. I played in, hard rock bands, soul bands, or, R&B bands, a jazz quintet, grew my hair out really long, and just felt like, having fun. So I did that for '89.
Yep.
I didn't even see a drum. I went to one drum corps show that year, like in, Southern Cal. And then 90 comes, and we're getting close to 90. And my buddy Rick Rodriguez told me about North Texas. And he said, I don't know what you're doing in school, but, they're giving scholarships out here for guys like you and me, for talented, blue double snare drummers or drum corps quality drummers to perform in the drum line there and get qualified for in-state tuition. And you basically have to take a few music classes, but then you can pursue anything you want. And I was a business major. So what made it work for me was that I could go do that. I could have some of my education paid for, and I could focus on getting my business degree because that was the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And when I was, playing drum set 4 or 5 nights a week and trying to go to school, that was really tough. So that actually sounded really good that I could go to an environment where I could drum. I could learn drum set from some of the greats, and some of the folks that I met at UNT are like Jim Riley from Rascal Flatts, and Jason Sutter from now playing with Cher and formerly Chris Cornell. Keith Carlock, these guys were all in the drum line. I
love Keith.
Yeah. And then Mac was out there, and other, Brian West. And so just like it was an all-star drum line.
Yep.
And back then there was no WGI for drummers. So we kind of pioneered the indoor drum circuit thing, and it started as a competitive thing at PAS. We didn't start it when I was there, but that drum line had as early as like 1982 or something. But I got to participate in that, and Paul Rennick was there, Float was there, Hardiman was. I mean, it was unreal.
Yeah,
and it was a lot of fun.
And to think that you can get a scholarship for marching percussion, which is like, it's kind of mind blowing, and that's cool because that's the stuff we all geek out over, and you're gonna pay me to go to school, or not pay me, but let me go to school for free to do that. That's pretty cool. Now, real quick, and we'll get back on this, but you touched on there was no winter line back then. But I wanted to ask you, and I talked to George about this, back in the early days of like the winter spring lines of Southern California, were you involved with a group called Shadowfax?
I was, yeah. So a guy named Tom Kellis ran Shadowfax, and he asked me to help out. And so I was helping out with the snare line, stuff like that, and just kind of helping them develop. And it was super early days. This was one of the first independent drum lines.
I was going to say they were like the first independent drum line in Southern California, if memory serves right. Yeah,
I was in that circuit that they competed in, and they blew my mind. I can to this day remember 2 things about Shadowfax. I hope my memory is correct. One is they did like a suicide bass visual where they spun around and it went down the drums and back up where they were going to hit each other's drums. Yeah. And the other one was that the snare line did a thing where they did a stick toss from one end of the snare line to the other end of the snare line.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is like magic. Like, what is this?
And see, I never got to see Shadowfax. I've heard stories, and it was like you're saying that I heard that they were super cool. I wish there was video or pictures or something.
Was that 89 or 90? When was
I
that?
want to say it was around that time, right around my transition year.
Yep.
I think it was when I was helping out Shadowfax. I taught a bunch of high schools, like Fountain Valley High School. I taught Homestead up here. I was always kind of teaching a high school when I was teaching a drum corps as well. So it was kind of my way of, eating.
Yeah, I think I even have a World of Pageantry somewhere that has like a Shadowfax score in there, and I saw the name. Every once in a while, I'll go through that, and I'll like everything else, I'll go through it a couple times, and you see old stuff, and it triggers your memory. And I wanted to ask you about that, and sorry that we time jumped there. Okay, let's time jump back forward. You're back at UNT, and
if there's anything to like close out on UNT, it was I was there for 2 years. Got to do PAS both years. Won the individual snare drum award the first year, which was 90.
Yep.
Then I didn't do it in 91. And then lo and behold, we are in Anaheim getting ready to perform. We were practicing at the VK Core Hall in Anaheim off of Knott and Ball Street. And the North Texas Drumline is there. And guess who shows up? Scott Johnson. And he comes and he says hi, and I saw him also after, and then he basically said, "Look, I'm teaching Santa Clara. What do you think?" So I wound up leaving UNT to go teach Santa Clara with Scott in early 1992.
Wow. So that explains the jump in getting back into drum corps.
That's right.
That's really interesting. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and get into 92. 92.
I should back up, George, because
go ahead.
I did teach the Blue Knights in 91 because I was at UNT. I was going to summer school. Rick was teaching the Blue Knights. He said, "Hey, Ralph's teaching. Come on out." I taught for the final tour or something,
Sure.
so it was pretty short. But I did teach Blue Knights in 91.
that's cool. They made finals that year too, right?
Yeah. That was I very specifically remember that. Because I was marching VK that year, and we didn't make finals, and they did for the first time.
Wow! So you got bumped by a former VK alumni.
Yeah,
bumping you guys out of finals.
But let's jump into the teaching thing, because now that we have the sort of the benefit of hindsight, those first several years that you taught. When I look at those lines from the outside, obviously including the ones that I marched in, they had some really strong narratives to it. So let's start with 92, and you and Scott, very blue, going to a very proud Santa Clara Vanguard. Ralph was no longer there, but there was, I want to say there was still a lot of Vanguard veterans there in that line. That line was very, and I will say that Vanguard especially was a group that was known for doing things their way. They were very ceremonial, they had their rituals. They were very proud, What was that like, jumping into that situation, especially at the age you were and at the age Scott was, just trying to figure out how to do this?
Yeah, it's funny. You said something. You said Ralph was gone, but Ralph was still very much present in the minds of those drummers.
Yep.
And I think that my lesson going in, first of all, I wanted to come in and learn just as much as I was going to teach. And they had just come off of 1991, where they won drums for Miss Saigon. It was like this game-changing book and show, and the speed at which and the rate they were flying around the field. So I was like, hey, I could learn something here, right? So my approach was always come in and learn. That said, there was a vibe. There was a definite kind of the blue guys are trying to teach the red guys. And so I approached it if it's clean, I don't really care, right? But I'm going to tell you if you're dirty. I'm going to tell you you're holding the sticks wrong. I'm going to tell you, the way it needs to be. And that was also the era that Murray Gussick was just a friggin' rock star with his writing. He was writing Martian Mambo, and he wrote Poof. And we played a lot of that stuff because it was just so good, right? My opinion is that it was too difficult. And you have to understand where I'm coming from. I was always from the mentality that I would rather play something super simple, piss clean, than play something really, really hard, dirty. And we kind of got past that, because if you remember my comments about 1987, sometimes it's about understanding how you accrue value rather than, always being perfect. So I was open to the idea. I was always like, absolutely, this stuff is too cool. And so there was that. The drumline, skill-wise, talent-wise, was very talented. But the thing that got in our way that year was the programming of the show was not where it needed to be to win.
Sure.
And that really impacted the morale of the corps and the drumline. We didn't have one of those hero-level drum features because the programming of the show didn't allow for it that year. And so it was weird, because if you're not winning and you're in a corps that is talented enough to win, it's just always hard. So we just kind of made the best of it that we could. We would show up every day and play as well as we possibly could. And then, it's over. So there was definitely some strangeness that year, and it was mostly like a transition year. But what it taught me was that you're never too old to learn. And then what I learned, I could apply to 93. And, we had a completely different story in 93 that I'm happy to talk about. But what I learned in 92 was an approach to teaching that helped me with every year after that.
And even the players that were new to the line that year, at least snare line wise, were really strong. You had Nick Angelis coming over, Jeff Queen, who I had marched with for a couple of years. I actually asked Jeff if he had any questions for you. And he was just very curious to hear exactly what you just described, which was what your take was, on what happened there as it was happening. Because I'm sure that before we see it from the outside, even as I was marching Blue Devils at the time, you could sort of see what was going on over there. But you guys see that stuff and feel that stuff first.
Yes.
Was there any sense of how do we handle this, or what do we? I don't know, what do we do? Because it's one thing to identify it, but then it's another thing to say, well, can this be turned around, or
Yeah. Well, we tried, because we made a lot of changes to the show that year, and I think the big thing was, if you look at what the 86 Blue Devils did with Channel 1, is they took a show from 10 years ago, and they did it pretty much the way they did it 10 years ago, and added maybe small flair of modernization. So in 92, we're like, well, if we do the same thing and we just kind of redo Fiddler and add a couple of modern, changes, it's gonna just, be awesome, right? But what we learned was that you kind of had to go bigger. You needed to reinvent it to really sell what people were really looking for back then. Now, in the early part of the tour, the alumni, they loved the show because it was right in their wheelhouse, right? But by the time you get on tour and there's these modern shows, like what the Cadets were doing, and even the Blue Devils were moving forward big time in 1992, we were stuck in retro land, and we were trying to dig out and figure out a way to make Fiddler relevant to the modern drum corps community, and it was too hard. We ran out of time and couldn't make it something that was groundbreaking. There was just too much legacy.
Yeah, I always tell people, that 92 Vanguard line, if you look at the people that were in that line, that's just like a stacked line of assassins, for a lack of a better term. I mean, those guys were stone cold, in your face, and they'll just take it to you. Especially the tenor line. I still rank the tenor line as up there. And we even talked about that in our last episode. That's still the benchmark for me as far as quad lines go. And I know that there's great stuff now that's probably better than that, but just that line overall. Did you have a hard time managing the personalities in that line, or was everybody pretty focused on performing? I don't know if that came out right. Let me say that with as good as that line was, was there individual personality issues, or was everybody locked in together like a line, or did you have to manage situations like a coach?
Well, let me. So you just talked about the tenor line. Let me talk about them very briefly, and then I'll talk about the personalities in general. Um, that was one of those things where you're just like, this is unbelievable. I mean, it was definitely very early on. You're just like, this is possibly the best tenor line ever.
Mm-hmm.
One of the real unfortunate things is that we only had 5 spots, but we actually had 6 guys. And the 6th guy, we had to tell him, it was very sad. He couldn't be in the line.
Oh,
He was just as good as everyone else in that line. And
Do you mind saying who that was?
I probably shouldn't,
Okay.
but it was one of those things where I felt so bad for the guy because he was super talented. And looking back, we should have fought for 6 because, I mean, you saw the 5 and 6 could have been just that much better, in my opinion. But the thing about Murray is he ran that tenor line, and we didn't have to worry about them at all. We just basically give them the book, and they had it figured out. And then we had to worry about blend and things like that. But they were very, serious drumline. Like I remember that the snare line in particular, they'd circle up after, and they would do somewhere between 40 and 50 push-ups just on their own, like not punishment. Just we're going to get strong, and so they took it very, very seriously. So I wouldn't say I had to manage personalities, but I definitely had to manage the aura of what the line was trying to be. And it was sometimes that was great for what we were trying to do, and sometimes it was like, well, we're trying to do something different here, and they definitely had a picture in their mind as to what they wanted to be. So
who
that's
was on,
about the only difference.
who was on staff that year besides you? So it was Scott, you, and was Murray like the quad tech player?
Okay. Absolutely, you might as well call him player coach.
Yeah.
But sorry, that's not entirely true. We brought Tyrus Allen out to help from out in front of the quads, help as well, and he's a former quad player as well. So he was teching the quad line as well. But for the most part, Murray kind of had it. But T was a big part of the staff because he was also a great ear for the rest of the ensemble. Had Scotty Sells on the pit. Kent Cater.
Kent Cater, icon, yeah. Bass drumming icon right there, yeah.
Yep. And then another icon, legend to the instrument is Robert Shavira, also known as the Jackal.
Oh, I've heard a lot of stories about the Jackal, yeah.
Just a great guy, and just he was very much about the Vanguard mystique as well. So he was a very powerful presence to get those guys acting and behaving and operating at the work ethic they needed to. And it wasn't just the cymbals. He was ever present with the line, and it was great. He's a very, very, very strong presence in a teaching situation.
So then the next year, you have a very different situation. Another line with a really strong narrative. I don't know how many. I know obviously Mike Apodaca marched. I know Jeff Queen went to Blue Knights.
Right.
Nick Angelis went to Star that year. Talk to us about 93 and how much different a teaching experience that was.
And start at day 1 auditions.
Let's go day by day.
Yeah.
It was such a different year because I show up in 92 and we're stacked.
Yep.
I show up in 93 and we're in trouble. I mean, and so my approach had to be very different. And what I was telling you earlier about, listening and learning and trying to help differently in 92, in 93, I had to be extra prescriptive because we had guys that just were coming right out of high school and did not have the experience. They didn't have the hands. They didn't have the feet. So it was one of those things where as a teacher, you kind of hope you get at least one of those where you have to really, really show your mettle. Mm-hmm. And 93 was that year. It was the transformation year. It was the complete change from a caterpillar to a butterfly. And it's one of my proudest moments because we talk about disappointment at retreat and things like that, where things don't go your way. Well, we started off so bad that we thought the Corps was not going to make finals. We thought we may not even be able to field, like a competitive drumline by any means. And at semifinals, we won field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was like, even if we didn't win the next night, because we know, things change, stuff like that. For me, that was such incredible validation of not just the teaching that happened that year, but the commitment that those members had and the journey that they went on. That, Lee Rudnicki has written a book about it.
Yep.
I mean, that journey, I think, to me is so inspiring, not just because of what we were able to accomplish, but just how dire the circumstances were in the beginning of that year, and how the staff came together, how the members came together, and the ultimate payoff was they really inspired at least one judge on the night of semifinals. And that to me was like, this is why we do it.
Yeah, and it's pretty cool because somebody recently gave me like a whole box of videos, and in that video was like some 93 Vanguard stuff, and one of it was a video recording from the first run through of the show ever at some camp like Memorial Day. And man, I love all the guys in that line. I know a lot of the guys, but talk about rough. There are literally people falling over each other in that first run, and to see it from that to where it made on finals night, I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I like some of the tapes of, I think, our finals warm up are around out there as well. And one of the strategies Lee and I had was to loosen them up. We discovered that if we were super intense all the time, they would get very tense. And so by the time we reached, the pinnacle around the finals warm-up time, is we would show up and we would wear stupid T-shirts and we would have beers and stuff like that. Back then we could do that. And it was about loosening the line up. And we were very tuned in to what the line needed from time to time. Sometimes we needed to go very hard and really be, kicking their ass. Other times we had to back off and say, this is what they need. And again, as a teacher, as an educator, being involved in the activity, that was just, I'm so proud of that whole journey, even though it was one of the hardest.
So for 93, I actually reached out to Nick Schilling just to ask him if there was anything, he wanted us to run by you. And for him, the question was pretty simple. Was there a point in the season? We know how it ended, right? But was there a point in the season where you felt like you went from struggling to turning the corner, and where you were like, yes, these guys can be really competitive. They are sort of now on their way. For him, he was actually curious if from your point of view, there was a moment or a time when you felt like that happened.
Yeah, there was a couple, actually.
Okay.
The funniest part is, I think it was Ypsilanti, Michigan. Tyler, snare drummer, forgot his uniform.
Oh, wow.
And the school was 30 minutes away, and we were on in 45 minutes or something like that. So he had to warm up in his normal clothes and stuff like that. So we're like so pissed off at this kid. And he has since, Tyler Dempsey, by the way, has turned into just one of the most, greatest human beings. He's a phenomenal player and a judge and all that. But he was absent-minded. He forgot his, equipment. So he warms up. He looks like a complete moron, totally blows the Vanguard image. It's bad enough, we've got these ugly, burgundy drums with yellow hardware. Tyler's looking like a bonehead, right? So the uniform shows up like right before, literally 5 minutes before we're walking on the field. Gets it on, line goes out there, smokes it, absolutely smokes it. And so that's when I think I looked at Lee, and we would commiserate every single night. And I think we looked at each other and went, this is going to be all right.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a DCI regional. It was a big show. And we either won drums or came close that night, because it was like, holy moly.
Yeah, Ypsilanti was preview of champions that year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it was
I remember, because for some reason or another, I remember. But yeah, I want to say it was preview. Shoot, let's say
I
it's
think
preview.
that sounds right. And now telling you that story, I think the other one that I now remember was Lee had probably the stupidest idea I've ever heard that we wound up turning into the end of the drum solo that year. I don't know if you guys remember that, but they actually play acted these notes that there were chimes that were happening in the pit.
The slow motion, yeah.
The slow motion thing was Lee's idea, and I said that is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. And by the time we figured it out and choreographed it and made it a thing and made it the climax of the solo, it actually worked. I was like, that's genius. And so that was the other thing where we were doing some really cool stuff that was not your typical thing. And like back to my original comment about accruing credit, things like that started to really help us out.
The snare lick in the drum solo, who wrote that? With the single stick.
Yeah, that's a Scott Johnson specialty. Scott, in his individual solo, a long time ago, did this thing where he would, and then he would, move the stick across his left
roll
hand.
it across his hand.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And so it was really him that he would always kind of come up during warm-ups. We were playing and stuff like. He'd just walk up to someone's drum, even when I was in the line, and he'd just do that. And nobody could do it really well. And then at some point we decided, what if somebody like a drum line actually played that together? Mm-hmm. And so we threw that challenge out there pretty early on. And these are just kids, man. They didn't know any better. So they pulled it off.
That's cool. Yeah.
Before we leave 93, there was one other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I don't remember you doing this at Blue Devils, but at finals, you did something where you did a snare line pants check at the warm up for finals. What is that about?
Yeah,
what is that?
I did it in 92 and 93. Mm-hmm. And usually Judy Johnson, Scott Johnson's wife, would have a video camera.
Yeah.
And we were trying to figure out ways to loosen everybody up and stuff like that. So if you, like when you're teaching, sometimes you walk to the rear of the line to try to hear some things differently. Mm-hmm. And at Vanguard, they wore white pants. And they were always like filthy and just didn't fit right and stuff like that. So one year I just did a goof and I just said, all right, we're just going to go by each one. So it was silly, but it was a way to cut the tension and loosen everybody up.
But yeah, I think that goes hand in hand how you were talking about keeping it loose. And because even in the video I saw you were wearing like some goofy glasses and
totally.
I hope they were goofy glasses, not your regular glasses, but yeah.
That's it.
Yeah,
right there.
Yeah. But it makes sense now that you talk about keeping the line loose by acting loose around them. That all kind of makes sense now.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they need you to kick their ass, but sometimes you got to loosen up.